Gospel according to Mark, the 6th chapter. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. And many saw them going and recognized them and ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. This is a wonderful passage here. It's one of those passages that's very familiar. In fact, it should be familiar. This is the only miracle we know is recorded in all 4 Gospels. This passage is recorded by all of Jesus' Gospel writers, different perspectives. And it's interesting to read each and every one of them because each and every one of them sees the same thing but from a different angle. You know, one of the things that you read here is we can sometimes just be wowed by the spectacle of it all and lose sight of the meaning. We can focus in on just the way it's presented and forget what it's really about. So, really, to start off, I'd like to say this is as political as I get. As long as there are politicians, there will always be people telling them that they're doing their job wrong. That's one of the truisms. You know, who can blame us? Because the ones who get involved in scandals, they're really noteworthy. And there's a lot to talk about in those stories. If you do your job well in politics, nothing much happens. There's no drama. Things get fixed. You listen to your constituents. But bad political leaders, they gain notoriety for reckless evil. You know, we may think, maybe this is a new development, but this is something that's been going on for as long as we can remember. In our gospel lesson, we see how Christ fulfills a promise that God makes. What's that promise? Well, if we look back to our Old Testament reading, the Old Testament passage that God condemns the failures of the leaders of Israel. In Israel, everyone who was powerful in the time of the writing of the Old Testament, these people, they were failing to live up. In fact, they were shepherds who weren't shepherded. The gospel answer is not to create new shepherds. The gospel answer is not to tell the shepherds you need to try harder and work more and be more obedient to the law. Instead, the gospel is that a new shepherd is on the scene. A new shepherd who will make everything right. And Jesus didn't come into a culture where the bad shepherds had all gone away. We just, as you remember, got finished talking about a very bad shepherd, King Herod, just last week. Now, some can be tempted. Some leaders can be tempted. And we see that Herod himself is tempted. But leadership here, there are three temptations: to gain renown, to extort the crown, and to hold others down. I decided to rhyme today, but why not? To gain renown, extort the crown, and hold others down. Our passage in Mark picks up after the interlude with Herod. All of Mark's characters are like us in that they're always just constantly asking who this Jesus fellow is. Mark presents us with Jesus' credentials, and each time these credentials are meant to put the ball in our court, as it were. Mark is a very interactive gospel. Many people criticize Mark because it just ends. It ends with the man in white in the tomb saying, "Go and proclaim that Jesus is risen." And we are left in the role of the witnesses who go rushing out of the tomb. Mark is constantly not spoon-feeding us. And this is very frustrating. People claim that the Bible tells you you need to be obedient to these things. It spoon-feeds you all the answers. And the moment Mark shows that that is not the case, people criticize him for his faithlessness. It's insane. No, Mark is constantly having people ask us the same questions here in Mark about who Jesus is. The disciples in chapter 5, verses 41, ask, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" His old neighbors, where did he get these things? In chapter 6, verse 2. And even Herod and his hangers-on are debating about the identity of this Jesus fellow. Mark gives us Jesus' credentials, but he wants us to remember that if we have doubts, we're not alone. The people who interacted with Jesus had questions about his identity, just who he was. And over against all of these people is the crowd. The crowd constantly following him. If I were to cite all of the instances where the crowd is asking just who Jesus is, we wouldn't have time for anything else. Now, we have been speaking about Jesus' credentials as a great prophet and a high priest. But now Mark is explaining that he is also the true God-anointed shepherd of the people. That is, he is Israel's true king. Mark does this by showing us the decadence, the paranoia, and the myopia, the single-minded vision of the leaders of Israel who are constantly looking out for themselves, their own desires, their own appetites. And he contrasts all of this missing the point with Jesus and his focus. In the feeding of the multitude, Mark demonstrates that Christ is something altogether different and more than we can even imagine. Now, the passage starts out as Jesus tells the disciples that they must go away and rest. If you're anything like me, you might immediately feel a little scandalized by this. You see, Jesus has just sent out these disciples to spread the word, and the good news people are following him. He's built up this demand for what he's selling, as it were. And instead of building on that, he says, we need to go away and rest. We've been through a lot. He's failing to capitalize on all the good press by his brand ambassadors as they have gone out teaching about Jesus and driving out evil and sickness. We've read that Herod has been attempting to get a larger title from Rome, and he throws himself a party for his nobles to demonstrate his power and to gain honor and fame. But Jesus is comfortable with his honor, because his honor is not something that is given to him by the people, nor is it an honor that is given to him by him being comfortable with himself. It is an honor which has been bestowed upon him by his mission from God. And his honor, therefore, allows him to rest, because he doesn't have to try and persuade the people that he's worthy of their honor. His single-minded focus on God is where he derives his honor. And because of that, he's comfortable enough to rest. Many of us can feel that pressure, can't we? Many of us can feel like the walls are closing in, or this 2,000-year institution called the church is going to crumble without our good works. We forget that our mission comes from God. Our rest comes from God. Our honor comes from God. And if we have any power or ability at all to go ahead and bring people to the gospel message, that will come from God as well. There is nothing to be afraid of. Whether it is mighty Rome, though, or pitiful Herod, the powers of the earth realize there are fringe benefits to ruling, and this gets to the second point. They envision that power justifies their taking goods and resources from the people, from their subjects. Instead, though, we contrast this with Jesus as he looks out on the crowd. And what does it say? He feels compassion. Now, of course, I love this Greek word, splagedzomai. It's just a fun word to say. I know, I saw some of you jump. It's like, did he sneeze? Should I say gesundheit? Splagedzomai. Splagedzomai, it means to be punched in the gut. It means that Jesus feels so sorry and disheartened for these people that he's literally sick to his stomach. He can't bear to watch them as their empty stomachs and leaderless lives come before him, looking for him to fill them, looking for him to lead them. And he has great compassion at their need. Let's pause and think about that. Don't we want a leader like that? Wouldn't we want to worship a king who, when he looks upon us, doesn't just see votes or accolades, but sees our need? And Jesus looks out, and here's the thing, I have to believe that that crowd didn't even realize their need. They didn't realize what problems they were in. Most of them just came out to see a celebrity. Most of them just came out to witness a magical healer. And Jesus wants so much more for them than that. Many of us come to Christ and we expect that Christ will top off our lives. Or maybe we do need something in our lives and we're just hoping that somehow or other God will put a Band-Aid on it. Instead, God looks at our lives and he sees our need even when we don't. And he feels a compassion for us that we don't even feel for ourselves. Christ is not motivated here by anything more than a need to be compassionate to his people. We can imagine We're told so often, even in the church, unfortunately, that God is some sort of tight-fisted deity, unwilling to hear the pleas of all but the most holy. Some people might say, well, that doesn't sound like God, but really you have to believe. It's about how much you believe. Friends, that turns faith into a work. That's putting the ball in your court. It's never been in your court. God has never been off on a far-off mountain that you have to go run to Him. God is available the moment you get down on your knees and pray to Him. Here we see that God is anything but the world's imagination of who God is. Because instead of standing at the top of the staircase and saying, come on, just a little bit further, you can do it. Just come on up here. God's right next to them. And God is willing to hear them. In fact, we have this notion that we have to climb a ladder, or climb a staircase, or ascend up to God. But when we confront Jesus, what does it say? He stepped down from heaven. Maybe I dwell on that a little bit too much. Maybe I've talked about that a little bit too much. But friends, let me tell you, the message you hear in the world is wrong. It's wrong. Christ has already done all of the hard work. All you have to do is put down your dukes. All you have to do is let Him hug you, embrace you, have compassion on you. He already has compassion on you. There's nothing you have to do to earn God's compassion. Anyway, because He has compassion, because He feels like He's been slugged in the gut, Christ puts off His vacation. He immediately puts off His vacation in order to care for His people. And once again, in Markan language, immediately the word spreads. People run, and we're told they run on foot. How else would they run? But Mark, he wants us to slow down and realize that they are really moving. Any way they can get the message out. People run. They either run to go spread the word, or they run after Jesus. There's a lot of running going on. A lot of people are busy. And they run after Jesus to spread this good news. They don't even know what the good news is, but they're spreading it. And Mark uses very martial language now to describe the people. He says now they're sitting down in groups of hundreds and fifties. And so we're thinking, okay, he's getting his battalions together. He's going to go storm. He's going to go storm the powers that be, and he's going to take it by force. And he's going to make sure everyone knows who's in charge. And he takes this group that's mobilized for war, and what does he tell them? He tells them to sit down on the green grass. Mark says it's green, by the way. Sit down on the green grass, and he feeds them. I can't imagine the kind of surprise that the people must have felt. Here they really would do anything for him. And he is saying, I'll do everything for you. They came to him with emptiness, and he filled them up. This upside-down leadership model that he has. Instead of mobilizing them to fight for the power of the leader, Jesus has them sit down on the green grass, feeds them, and gives them Bible lessons. Christ isn't holding down would-be soldiers or overcoming would-be tyrants, but instead he allows everyone to look up to him in order that they may be saved. Rather than demanding sacrifice to feed one man's ego, we see that the only sacrifice we make is putting aside our worldly pride and ambitions and just sitting at our Master's feet. If that message is terrifying to you, it should be. All of us go to God and tell God exactly how the world should be run. All of us go to God and tell God exactly how our lives should be. That's the terrifying thing. The message is terrifying today as it was back then because we all have our little would-be Herod moments. We want fame. We want to be crowned. And sometimes we want all of it at our neighbor's expense. But Jesus here offers us a different vision where we can watch as God's promised kingdom washes over us. You see, the reign of Christ is not limited to us alone, but it's open to everyone who puts their trust in Him. This miracle is not some sort of parlor trick or a question where we say, do it again a little bit slower this time. No. The feeding of this group shows that the plenitude of eternity is at Christ's disposal, and He freely gives it to people who are in need. And as we have experienced the infinite plenitude of Christ, our neighbors are looking for that same thing. There are many distracting political agendas. There are many alluring movements that can pull our neighbor as well as ourselves away from the promises of God. But when this happens, we should rather just go back and listen to what Jesus says to all His disciples. To feed people with the gospel message. And that gospel message is that God's kingdom has arrived. Amen.